In particular, climate justice for Africa. That is the big challenge ahead of COP22. COP22 is an African COP. That is where our priorities lie. That is where our hopes lie.
Climate justice for Africa. That was the priority of COP22. But as the United Nations Convention on Climate Change wrapped up in Marrakesh, Morocco this week, was there enough done to successfully address the concerns of the host continent? Agricultural yield in Africa is expected to halve in the coming years, and some assessments project that up to 250 million people could be exposed to water shortages by 2020. So given its small responsibility in global warming, the issue of adaptation remains Africa's #1 priority. So then, are other global parties coming to the table? And what else can be done to mitigate the effects of climate change on the African continent? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, it's been a week of impassioned speeches and high hopes at the UN's Climate Change Summit, COP22. Dozens of African leaders amassed in the Moroccan city of Marrakesh this week to build on efforts to implement the Paris Agreement. They're hunting a practical plan and money to help curb global warming. Penina Karibe was at the event where she filed this report.
It's not often you get this many African leaders to the same place at the same time, but there's a lot at stake here in Marrakesh, and China has made clear what is really important.
This conference must arrive at a package on capacity building and improving the developing countries' capacities in the areas of early warning, disaster reduction and prevention, infrastructure, policy management, statistics and accounting, and access to finance.
Africa should be our focus for support. That's why we should support this African partnership with others. We should support that this Marrakesh conference should be a success. Because this conference is being held in Africa, we need to ensure that Marrakesh conference should be a success.
Whether it is a success, we'll see in the next couple of days. Whether Africa does indeed see some solid funding. China, though, says it is prepared to do more.
China is ready to work with other parties in creating a fair, effective and win-win global climate change regime. And we're ready to make a greater contribution to this end.
CCTV.
Now, during the course of this week, many African leaders have made addresses and statements to the convention. Let's take a listen at what they had to say with regards to Africa's climate needs.
The parties should build on the momentum gathered in Paris to take the climate change agenda forward and put in place necessary mechanisms for effective implementation on the Paris Agreement on climate change.
The development of the rule book to guide the implementation of the agreement must continue to take on board the key elements of the agreement and keep in focus the objective, principle, and provisions of the Convention, including equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities and parity between mitigation, adaptation, and provisions for enhancing means of implementation.
The Lake Chad Basin, for example, has shrunk to a mere 10% of its original size, and this has seriously affected the livelihood of over 5 million people and contributed in the growth of insecurity in the region, including the emergence of Boko Haram as a terrorist group. Hence the urgent need to resuscitate Lake Chad.
Excellencies, past tendencies towards impositions and dictating to others by highly industrialized countries must give way to partnership and equitable solutions.
To harmonize our approaches for implementation of the Paris Agreement. Let us respond to the challenges of climate change and make this world a better place for current and future generations.
Now, even before COP22 began last week, it was already being billed as the COP for Africa and the COP of Action, referring to the implementation of the Paris Agreement. But it is difficult to tell whether that has been the case on the ground in Marrakesh. Dan Williams spoke to the UN Special Advisor of the Secretary General on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Climate Change, David Nabarro, to find out what opportunities have come out of the convention and take advantage of.
David, what is your assessment as to whether this really will be a COP of action?
Last year in Paris, we were focusing on trying to see whether the world's nations were ready to make a proper and binding agreement on the future of the way in which the world is organized, so that we can stop the increase in world temperature and so that we can be resilient in the face of climate change. The agreement was reached, it's been signed up to, it's come into force in world record time. This year we're into a COP that is one of ambition and action. It's very different. It's a business-like atmosphere, rolling up our sleeves, getting together and working out how to operate differently and to make sure that we are taking climate seriously in everything we do. It's got two parts to it. The first is all activities to be low carbon. The technical term is decarbonized. And that means making sure that when it comes to energy, when it comes to transport, when it comes to roads and buildings, that we reduce the extent to which operating our world is associated with releasing carbon into the atmosphere. Secondly, we're climate-proofing everything, making sure that structures, livelihoods, and everything we do is capable of coping whatever the weather throws at it, because climate change means not only heat, it also means unpredictable weather. So that dual focus on decarbonizing and on resilience in the face of unpredictable weather is what we're focusing on in this COP, and we're seeing it everywhere.
What are the opportunities that you've identified in terms of Africa from this summit?
Africa is a continent that relies heavily on agriculture. The same dual focus that I've been describing for everything we're seeing here of decarbonizing and promoting resilience is evident in all aspects of land use and agriculture in Africa. That means having patterns of agriculture that reduce the amount of carbon they release, also patterns of agriculture that reduce deforestation and therefore are better able to trap and prevent carbon being in the atmosphere. So in terms of Africa, it's been agriculture. It's also focusing on resilience, how to make sure that African society is able to cope with adverse weather events. That's been a big focus. When it comes to development in Africa, how to make sure that electrification and water access can be done in ways that take account of climate change and that do not release carbon. So that's solar and other renewable energies for electrification, and it's trying to make sure that water is used efficiently in agriculture and in domestic environments. Just one last point about this. Let's remember climate change hurts poor people most. It's important that in dealing with climate change, we go for a just approach, an approach that takes account of vulnerable people and protects them. Otherwise, we're not approaching this fairly, and in the end, it will not be an appropriate way to work. Remember that the people who suffer most as a result of climate change are often the people who contributed least to it through their activity.
In terms of China, what have you made, what's your assessment of their leadership that they've shown in making that Paris Agreement a reality?
So China has taken a major step forward in being a country that says we're going to develop, but we're going to do it on a low carbon pathway. We're going to have inflection where we move actually to reducing the amount of carbon we produce within the next few years. And China is also saying we've got technologies and ideas that we can share with other countries. We look at China's leadership and we say, absolutely amazing. And I would like to thank the Chinese government and the Chinese people for their leadership and what they have done up till now and what they will go on doing as part of South-South cooperation and contributing to helping countries everywhere to decarbonize and to be resilient in the face of climate change.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, my expert guests will help unpack the outcomes of COP22. To stay with us.
For Africa, there is limited finance available to enable African economies to implement their commitments to the agreement. We hope by debating these issues in the pavilion, we can address the financing question. There is also the question of capacity. Very limited capacities in many fields of climate change in Africa. And we think that in Morocco, we can begin to address issues around technology transfer, support for capacity building, as well as ensuring that adequate finance is made available to Africa.
That was the UN Economic Commission for Africa's climate governance expert James Murombenzi speaking on Africa's needs with respect to the outcomes of COP22. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to further offer analysis into the outcomes of the UN Climate Change Convention, I have expert guests standing by. In Marrakesh, the African Union Commissioner for Rural Economy and Agriculture, Tumusime Roda Peace. In Kampala, Jackson Muhindo, he's the Resilience Program Officer at Oxfam, Uganda. In Lagos, Olusegun Yusuf, he's the Africa region at the Global Urban Planning and Climate Action Partnership. Thank you all for joining in the conversation. Commissioner Tumusime, I'll start off with you as you're monitoring very closely events there in Marrakesh at COP22, and you have been following the Africa Day, I presume. Now, climate challenges facing Africa are dominating this year's UN Climate Change Conference there in Marrakesh. What do you consider the big issues coming out of the conference for Africa?
You know, last year we agreed to a landmark agreement in Paris in COP21. Now COP22 is really focusing on implementation, on action. The challenge which we have is to look at COP21 agreement can be operationalized. So we are looking at the mechanisms which are going to help the details. Those were never worked on when we are in Paris. So now these are the issues which we are looking at. How do we get the parties commit to themselves on how much they are going to reduce carbon emission? For example, a commitment on resources. So all those details were never worked on. And this is what we are looking at. Then we are also looking at intended national contributions which were submitted for COP21.
Right.
These are areas which we have to see how they can be taken forward. So this is the action commitment at COP22 is the in thing, and this is what is taking a lot of our time.
All right, Olusegun Yusuf, you're monitoring all this from Lagos. Is that what you want to hear?
Yeah, quite all right. What she has actually highlighted, actually one of the issues creating bottlenecks around taking a global action that will be effective. And I believe that at the conclusion of the COP22, if these things are set in place right, we'll be able to achieve a meaningful solution going forward.
Jackson Muhindo, your thoughts on that?
Yes, I'm following on that, and we're eagerly waiting to see the outcome of this conference in Marrakesh. First of all, we are aware that there was a commitment in Paris, and the developed countries committed themselves to fulfill the commitments. We are following up on the pledge from the developed countries, their contribution of $1 billion to support adaptation interventions in Africa. We have seen that where countries have committed themselves, they have been supporting, but we can see that most of them are supporting in terms of, offering loans to African countries. Others have actually changed their traditional funding strategies into climate change financing, and we want to see that streamline at this conference in Marrakesh.
Commissioner Tumusime, the COP is saying they want to move from talk to action. In terms of Africa, though, what are the immediate actionables for Africa at this point?
Africa Day event really focused on a number of areas. Africa requires resources for adaptation. How do you change Africa into a green, climate resilient economy? The economy of Africa must be able to adapt, but then we need resources. So the emphasis on that is that the commitments by the partners need not be only in theory. We want to see it in action. The partners are not coming out to say, yes, this is the money. Now, out of, for example, 100 billion, only 10 has so far been committed to, and in fact 9 has been signed for. Even in 9, you cannot even trace it. So it becomes a challenge on our part. We need technology. Africa requires technology. If we have to change the way we have been doing business, we need modern technology. Africa doesn't have that. Capacity also is important. So these are the issues which we were discussing at Africa Day yesterday, and it was really good. We had heads of state. The heads of state came here and decided to say we must support our leader, that is Morocco. The Morocco this time is the head of COP. So the heads of state as well were here. They tried as much as possible to show that this is what Africa is doing.
Olusegun Yusuf, the whole question of resources for adaptation for Africa, and we've heard the commissioner there saying that probably only 4% has come out so far. Where are we, though, in terms of those pledges of that $100 billion that was pledged about 6-7 years ago? Where are we on that?
Yeah, one thing that I have actually seen going forward on the Paris Agreement is that Africa is seen as one that will make a mark globally if resources are actually provided for it to move ahead. But currently, Africa needs a lot of investment and for Africa to be able to adapt to climate change. But if we are going by anything, I believe that the position in Marrakesh today, which Africa we have a common front that we are pushing for, that if we can push for this common front to the end, we'll be able to see that the commitment that are needed from the developed countries are actually in, and we can move ahead to have a finance for whatever solution we have to create.
Commissioner Tumisime, as we look for funding for adaptation for Africa's initiative, China says, though, that it is ready to make a contribution to global efforts in addressing climate change through the South-South cooperation. Can you clarify this for us, though, because how is this special fund to support South-South cooperation, climate fund, climate change situations going to work?
Now, you know, for Africa, the biggest attention for Africa must be in agriculture, because agriculture feeds the majority of the people. It employs the majority of the people in Africa. So we need to see the strategies which can support adaptation to agriculture. You have seen the continent being ravaged by drought. Now also the floods are coming. So the South-South cooperation of China has to be channeled through a number of sectors, but agriculture needs to have a priority first as an entry point. And once you get it right in agriculture, then you can move to other sectors. Of course, we need water, we need infrastructure which is resilient. Our cities, you have seen, they are all, in fact, not resilient to climate change, the bridges, the roads. So there is a lot we can really use these resources, support in capacity development for climate change by China and other countries in South-South cooperation framework. So we are looking forward to this kind of support.
Clearly, resources and finding resources for adaptation is quite an issue here. Jackson Muhindo, what do you think, though, that Africa needs to do in order to attract more funding in this area?
First of all, as African countries, we have also to meet our own commitments in terms of national governments. For instance, for Uganda, I'll just give an example of Uganda. We have actually gone ahead to, operationalize our national policy on climate change adaptation, which for me, I think is a very key, strong stride in terms of implementing what is in the international frameworks, but also our nationally intended contributions is very key. That one is giving us some good preliminary targets on how we can be able to support the different sectors in terms of adaptation. Meanwhile, as we wait for the developed countries to be able to send us what they committed to be able to support the African countries. For Uganda, I can say we are already moving ahead. We've been able to finalize our development strategy, our national development strategy, and the development strategy is integrating issues of climate change as very critical in terms of addressing the current phenomena of climate change. So I think as African countries, we need to also start committing ourselves and fulfill our commitments as we wait for the international community to also commit and fulfill their commitments.
Commission to come to a point that has been dominating part of the talk there in Marrakesh, and that is the U.S.'s involvement in the future going forward, because U.S. President-elect Donald Trump had mentioned that he may cancel U.S. involvement in the Paris Agreement on fighting climate change. Is that having an impact at all in the ongoing negotiations in Marrakesh?
You know, the word by a leader is normally definitely taken very seriously. So the word by the U.S. incoming president to go against the agreement which was signed to recently is not really a very positive issue. But I would like to say that everybody is very, very much aware that climate change is here, and it is here to stay. We must ensure that we respond to, we can't break it. So I'm sure within the governance of the United States, what Trump said during campaign may not be followed now, because we believe that that was really the politics. But for us in Africa, going forward, we must ensure that we abide by the agreement. And that is why many, many countries in Africa have come forward. It's not easy. We need capacity development. Africa doesn't have that much needed capacity. But also the U.S. must realize that it's not going to go it alone. The U.S. government, I'm sure within its governance, is going to see how they can relate to other global economies, so they cannot move alone. So here in Marrakesh, everybody is not thinking so much about what Trump said. He's thinking much about how we can go forward.
Right. I want to get a final comment from you all, and I'll start off with you, Jackson Muhindo, in Kampala, because Africa often has limited bargaining power in negotiations on the global scene. Do you think when it comes to COP22 and, of course, implementation of the agreements of the Paris Agreement, do you think that Africa is faring well? Do you think that Africa's objectives going into COP22 will be finally heard?
Yes, thank you. I think the objectives of Africa joining the COP22 will be heard. First of all, I was impressed with the affirmation from the UN President, Peter Thompson, when he says that actually climate change adaptation, we need to maintain the momentum moving forward to ensure that we raise resources for adaptation, to ensure that we continue committing ourselves to the pledge that we made during the Paris Paris agreement in last year. So I think for me, Africa will be able to achieve what took them to COP22.
Olusegun Yusuf in Lagos.
Yeah, I believe strongly that Africa will achieve meaningful results from the COP22. Following what we have going on back in Nigeria, we can see the commitment of the government to see that we achieve something meaningful, and much more than just looking within our own spheres of life, which is Nigeria itself. We have seen the president of Nigeria being able to look within the West African bloc to get enough support for us to be able to achieve a reasonable solution towards climate change. So I believe that a lot of achievement will come out of this going forward, and also seeing the commitment of leaders across Africa towards the challenges of climate change.
Commissioner Tumisume, you have the final word on this.
Let me say that this COP22, Africa is going to get even much more than ever before. There is increasing attention to Africa. We see all the globe, the partners, the donors, they are focusing on Africa. Given the challenge, for example, of immigration, they want to see Africa create more jobs, because climate change also contributes quite a lot to immigration, which is ravaging also Europe. I have seen for us in Africa committing ourselves to 2 initiatives. Africa Renewable Energy Initiative. It is already attracting resources, and the countries are going to be supported in this area. We have also submitted Africa Adaptation Initiative, and this one as well is also attracting resources. And we see that the chances of getting access even to resources which is available under the Green Climate Fund, under the GF, is increasing day by day. And also in negotiations, Africa is more ready than any other region. And we have had a ready kind of negotiators, we have the ministers, and we have the heads of state. No region has got that. So Africa here at COP22 is well positioned and is doing very, very well.
And that's all we have time for this week. We leave it there for the moment on Talk Africa. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Marrakesh, the African Union Commissioner for Rural Economy and Agriculture, Tumusime Roda-Peace. In Kampala, Jackson Mohindo, he's a Resilience Program Officer at Oxfam, Uganda. And in Lagos, Olusegun Yusuf is the Africa Regional Coordinator at the Global Urban Planning and Climate Action Partnership. And remember, you can join the conversation at home through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more on Talk Africa. Goodbye.